Welcome to our first broadcast. I'm Charlie Rose. I don't know what it means, but as we begin, the Giants are losing, the Jets are winning, the Mets have a new manager, and the Knicks a new coach. That plus the New York Times now cost 50 cents. We take note tonight of the deathless weekend of a legend, jazz trumpeter Miles Davis. We'll hear his music early in the broadcast and at the end. Our broadcast tonight and every night is about people who make news and ideas that attract our attention. We'll give you tomorrow's headlines tonight and provide a forum to meet interesting people and engage controversial ideas. We begin tonight with Professor Leonard Jeffries. Who is he? What is he saying? What does he mean? And who is listening? Then three well-known journalists, Jerry Nachman, Sam Roberts, and Utrice Leid, talk about Jeffries and about Governor Cuomo's vision for a revitalized New York. The governor himself will be here in several weeks. You may have seen an extraordinary film on Lyndon Johnson tonight. We'll meet the filmmaker David Grubin later. We begin now with an excerpt from the speech that created the storm that swirls around Professor Leonard Jeffries.
Where do you want to start? Do we want to go to Amsterdam and get a book by Jonathan Israel on European Jewry in the age of mercantilism, 1550 to 1750? And there's a picture of the Amsterdam synagogue, which was the center of slave trading for the Dutch. Amsterdam became the leading port in this period of time for slaving. And it was around this synagogue that the slaving system was established. Now, we're not talking about most Jews. Most Jews were being beat up and down Europe and persecuted for being Jewish. We're talking about rich Jews, and we specifically make that distinction. We're not talking about white folks in general when we talk about oppression. We're talking about the wealthy white folks, the powerful white folks that make the decision. So let's make some decisions, some clarity when we're talking about these things. But the documentation is there. We are now preparing the 10 volumes dealing with the Jewish relationship with the black community in reference to slavery, so we can put it in the school system.
Joining us now is Professor Leonard Jeffries. Welcome to the broadcast.
Glad to be here.
Yeah. This was a 2-hour speech. Albany, July, 20th, 1991?
Yes.
Much has been made of it. A controversy swirls around it.
Too much has been made of it.
In what way?
Well, for the last 3 years, there's been an enormous controversy nationally over changes in the curriculum. And I was asked to become involved in this process in the fall of 1988. And in fact, a letter was sent to me from a committee, a task force put together by the Commission of Education that was interested in curricular changes. 4 of us were asked to become involved aiding the task force. Myself dealing with the African American experience, Dr. Hume, Asian scholar from Hunter College, dealing with the Asian American, Dr. Rodriguez Fraticelli dealing with the Latino Puerto Rican, and Professor White dealing with the Native American. The 4 of us independently reviewed over 150 documents from the Department of Education of the State of New York as to whether they really were applicable to our people's experiences. And we all concluded, even though there were significant changes made with the revisions that occurred in '87, the documents did not reflect the global perspective, the worldview of our peoples. And so we submitted our reports. It went to the task force. They added their recommendations. And as a result, in July '89, a report entitled The Curriculum of Inclusion came forth calling for changes in the curriculum. It was after that occurred that the storm over changes in the curriculum took place, and I was at the center of it.
It doesn't
being
seem
used as a red herring or a scapegoat for any changes.
On the question of curriculum changes, the basic thrust that the curriculums in high schools and schools around the state of New York ought to reflect the contribution of African Americans and Africans to this country.
And Asians and Native Americans, and that's what we call for.
That idea,
we haven't called for anything.
That idea
less
gets
than
you
that.
a lot of support. A lot of people are with you on that.
No, they're not.
Well,
People
but wait,
cannot
hold
deal
on one
with
second.
the
Let me take
seriousness of the African experience in the world and the African American experience. And when they do deal with it, it reflects harshly on the American scene, where you have a Jefferson and a Washington that was more than just founded. They were just more than founders of this nation. They were slave-owning merchants. And when you have to deal with the contradiction of people saying that we are for liberty, justice, and equality and putting it in their basic documents and having hundreds of people enslaved, including their own children, and never freeing them, then there's a basic contradiction which is at the heart of this nation.
You'll get a lot of people who may not agree with your political philosophy, but will say to you that the fact that George Washington owned slaves at the time ought to be included in any full perspective on who they were and their contribution to the founding of this country.
There's not a lot. The reaction has been that it's anti-American to raise these issues, and that raising the issues of the centrality of the experience of peoples of color is anti-white.
But that's
been
not
the reaction.
what's created the controversy.
The
Professor
controversy
Jeffrey, the
did
controversy
not occur in July of this year. The controversy has been raging for 3 years.
But it exploded in July of this year when people saw that 2-hour speech and saw...
as a charge exploded in July, but the controversy exploded in its full fervor in April the 20th.
Why do you...
Listen now, you're not listening. April the 20th, 1990 is when the New York Times came up with their first major article trying to stamp me as anti-white, anti-Semitic with crazy theories, pairing me with someone called Professor Levin, and this went international. The recent controversy was national and local in New York.
Let me get some questions in.
50 major media descended upon me with all of this misinformation and disinformation that the New York Times had put forth, and that controversy has raged ever since.
You feel like you have been misquoted and misunderstood
it's not
by the
misquoting,
press?
it's media lynching, pure and simple. It can be documented, the names, the dates,
help me clear it up then on a number of things. Tell me what you said about Jews and slave trade.
We always say that you cannot say, as Diane Ravage and others have said, Arthur Schlesinger, that Africans sold Africans and they sold them to whites who sold them to Arabs, etc. When you're talking about the slave trade, you're talking about an international system involving all types of people across several continents.
But what people heard were you saying Jews and singling out Jews.
Because
and that's
the New York
what they
Post
heard.
has been from the very beginning picking out certain things and highlighting them to
heard
create
you and
hysteria.
They felt like you were creating and pointing your finger at Jews. And when other historians like Professor James Shenton of Columbia have said Jews were only peripheral to that, there were a whole lot of people involved. No, let me finish. Involved in slave trade. But when you point your finger at one group of people, it looks like it's anti-Semitic, and that's what it looks like. And he's with you on the curriculum issue, as you know.
Then he ought to be with us on who was involved in the enslavement of African people.
But when you point your finger at people, it looks like you're looking for a scapegoat. It looks like you're looking for a villain.
For truth.
And it creates...
We're looking for truth.
Why point out one group of people?
We do not, and let's make that clear.
All right.
We do not, we have not, we will not. We want to make sure we include the Dutch, the Swede, the Brandenburg Germans, the Spanish, the Portuguese.
You did not mean to point out...
We did not point them out. It was taken out of context.
In the speech that we just saw?
It was taken out of context, as it was in other speeches.
Right, now hold on. Let me read you the transcript. Don't read to me. Let me talk to you.
This is the transcript of this.
Don't read. Let me talk to you, because we can do better if we talk. Help me clear up other things. You're saying you didn't point out Jews with respect to the slave trade.
I want to tell you how we handled this whole question. Here it is right here. I went May the 16th, 90, after the New York Times article went international, UPAP, 50 major media descended upon me, questioning whether we are saying black people, or ICE people, Sun people, whether we are saying Jews were this and Jews were that. Mayor Koch asked me to come down to his office. May the 16th we did. We brought the books. And this is the transcript of the discussion. And this is how we phrased the question of enslavement.
I'm going to lose time. I'm going to lose time if you read it to explain some other things.
You won't understand. What we say is we're not talking. We say that everybody was involved in the enslavement of African peoples. The Catholic Church initiated the slave trade in the early 1500s. The Pope apologized in the 1980s for when he went to Africa. The Protestant Reformation was born at the same time, and that the slave trade was being institutionalized, and it compromised itself on the altar of enslavement. Luther's Reformation began in 1517 and 1516, and the contract to bring Africans systematically to the African New World occurred at that time. It was the Pope. It was the Spanish throne that agreed to the enslavement.
Professor Jeffries, please don't read anymore. Don't read anymore, so I can.
Much of the merchant banking class was handled by Jews. We're not talking about hundreds of thousands or millions of Jews poor in their communities. We're talking about merchants. Merchants have no nationality. Merchants have no religion. Money is their religion.
Why point out their ethnicity?
On the altar of profit making, we are not talking about rabbis. We are not talking about Jewish scholars. We're not talking about Jews who have been struggling to survive. We're talking about people who handle the money. And so when we do, Let's get at the whole question. We're talking about the Danes,
Professor
the
Jeffries, let me move
Swedes.
on. I hear you, and I hear you clearly when you're saying.
Well,
and you
let's
seem
deal with Scanton,
Okay.
because Scanton said that Jeffries' scholarship is questionable when he raises the question of who might have been involved. He says he read the work by Eric Williams, Capitalism and Slavery, and he opened it up to the index, and Eric Williams and Capitalism and Slavery
And he did
had
not
no
see
reference,
Jews there.
Had no reference, but that's not being scholarly.
Yeah.
You don't open up somebody's references and then say that's scholarship. Eric Williams produced many works. This is one from Columbus to Castro. And if you open up and if you look for the index, you'll find several references to the Jewish community's involvement at the level it was with merchants, et cetera, in enslavement. Why is there this complete denial? Why is everybody denial of any involvement of any Jews, of any significance in the slave trade? I cannot understand it. It has to do with some type of mental thinking that
let me tell you what I think, because
nobody's religion prevented them from being enslaved. Africans were involved in slavery. Arabs were involved. Christians,
they believe that
Jews,
you
and
see
Gentiles.
you pointing the finger at a time.
Well, people who were involved in the destruction of Jewry are pointed. They chased them all around the world to find out whether they were the people who were involved in the Holocaust of Jews. You mean the Holocaust of Africans that went on for 400 years with 100 million of our people being destroyed? We cannot say that these people were involved and these people were involved on the altar of enslavement, on the altar of making money, on the profiteering that has gone on. We have an obligation to say that 100 million of our ancestors have not been spoken for. Millions of Native American ancestors that are ours have not been spoken for. We have an obligation. If you don't understand that, then no one will ever understand it, because it's been the Jewish community that has pointed the finger at those people who have oppressed them.
Let me raise this question with you. This is a time in this community when we need healing, when we need reconciliation.
Truth will heal.
Let me finish.
A lie will not heal. The lie of white supremacy, the lie that blacks are the victims of their own victimization, and when we raise the question of our oppression, we're dealing with victimology.
Who is articulating that lie?
People have said when we raise the question of our enslavement or our degradation, we are dealing with oppression studies, we're dealing with victimology. No one says that when the Jews deal with the Holocaust. When they deal with the Holocaust, that's a sacred mission to raise these questions. When we deal with our Holocaust, we are being oppressive, we're being we're being victimologists. It is wrong. It is incorrect, and that's what the hell has been going on. And we need to get to the bottom of it, because we have a mission to get to the truth. We cannot march into the 21st century with this 19th century ideology of white supremacy. And that's the way we feel. And it's not me, it's millions of us across this nation and the world. We are going to get at the truth of our relationship, and the relationship is going to be based upon integrity.
Help me get at the truth and on
it's
the number.
It's going to be based upon integrity.
Let me get in.
People have profiteered off of African peoples. They have profiteered off of African peoples.
That's part of the history that we know.
Okay, and everybody has been involved in it.
But don't point the finger at specific people and reflect on their ethnicity. That's what bothers people at a time in when a community needs healing, and a community seems to need people who are looking for a way to bridge the gap between them and look for a need for understanding.
Was every ethnic group involved in the making of Hollywood and the negative images of African peoples? Was every ethnic group involved in the making of the Sambo image, in the making of the Stephen Fletcher?
Yes.
Which was the ethnic group that had a particular interest in that, a particular influence in that? Why can't we get at the truth of that? That's not a defamation of all Jews. It's a defamation of European Jewry that was participating in white supremacy in America,
say things,
reflecting a
when
culture
you
of white
say
supremacy.
that, Professor Jeffries, there you go. You raise the flag of a whole group of people rather than pointing a question about an individual entrepreneur.
Of our oppression,
but
and our
broad brush
degradation,
strokes at a time that we need people to reconcile, to speak softly, to communicate, and to somehow find
what? Charlie Rose, to reconcile about what? A lie of white supremacy?
No one's asking you
to
reconcile.
A lie that we have not been involved in this nation in the building of it?
Let me
a
read
lie
to you
that
a
we
couple
are
of
just criminals and dope dealers?
May I read
a lie
to you
that
now?
our families are fractured and we have not participated?
Listen
that we need affirmative action and no one else has had it?
Listen to this. Time magazine, in a piece about you, said, for long stretches of his speech before an Empire State Black Arts and Cultural Festival last month, Jeffries made an intense and effective case for blacks to study African history and learn the buried side of their own stories. But he kept veering obsessively back into a snarling racism. Strange to watch the intelligent angels of his nature wrestling with nasty little cretins. The cretins won a few rounds. When you hear that, is that a fair reflection of what happened in that speech?
Have you been around for the last 3 years when I have been attacked up and down America in Time magazine, New York Times? The New York Post has been particularly venomous in this attack. When they paired me with the Commissioner of Education because they're trying to get rid of him. I don't even know the Commissioner of Education. We only met one.
Venomous?
Yes,
well, the editor of the New York Post will be here.
Okay, well, good, because they have led the attack in an unscrupulous way, and tearing me
to
for
the issue
the last
generally
2 or 3
of
well, I'm speaking to
anti-Semitism
it.
in society
We're not,
today.
the issue is not anti-Semitism. The issue is the multicultural curriculum, and the people who have been arrayed against it have used the flag of anti-Semitism so that the truth, in terms of the human experience, is not going to be a part of the educational process.
People are not raising the flag. People are responding when they see an ethnic group pointed to as somehow scapegoats and responsible for the plight of others.
When people are tracking down Nazis all over the world, is that pointing a finger at a particular ethnic
Are you
group?
making an equivalency between Nazis
I
and
am
somebody?
saying someone who enslaved my ancestors, someone who enslaved African peoples, was doing the same death and destruction that was done to the Nazis.
Okay.
And the parallel is there, and if you can't make it, that's the cognitive dissonance we've got to get at. People who destroyed the Native Americans and are living on the Native American lands, that's the same process of white supremacy that the Nazis represented, the Aryan myth of a superior people.
People is one
and that's
thing,
what has to be
but
equated.
people is one thing,
There's
and
no
an ethnic
superiority
group
in terms of the destruction of Jews as opposed to other
people
peoples.
is one thing, and an ethnic group is another. To speak at one particular group and enlarge whatever you may be saying is a whole nother issue. And that's what, at a time in which we're in conflict in this community, that's what worries people.
But
let me finish,
are
though.
those
Let me
questions
finish.
raised
You
about
have
the defamation
influence.
of black
You
youth
have
when they're run
influence
across
with
the
young
TV?
people.
I know, and you
You
better
have, and
you better
1,000 young
believe I
people
have
wait.
influence.
And therefore,
so have other
it's a
African scholars,
time for
because
someone.
we've got to heal our people in the death and destruction imposed upon them. Black youth have been defamed across this land. Every time you look at a newspaper or a TV, and the New York Post has taken the lead in taking black youth. We have millions of black youth in this nation, millions in the city, Latin and black youth, and every time you look at the page, there's one being run across as if we have all the crime and all the criminal elements in our community. It is a defamation of our people, and it is clear.
It
it's
sure
been
is.
led
It
by
sure-
rags like the New York Times, no matter what the editor of the New York Post and New York Times, no matter what they say. It's clear to us.
That
We're
what?
not gonna,
That what?
That the defamation of our people has been occurring in the newspapers, that they do not say that just a few black youth or this, they single out all black youth. When they had the Central Park case, all black youth were stigmatized as
weren't.
people. Well, you weren't here in New York to listen to what was going on. You should have heard what was going on. And when the people in other situations, like the St. John's case, it was just a case of a woman who happened to be in a situation that she shouldn't have been in.
I'm out of time. Tell me this last point. What do you want to see changed?
We want to deal with the truth, and we've got to get at that truth no matter who it hurts and no matter whose difficulty is caused. We've got to get at the truth in order to move together.
And people who say you're anti-Semitic?
It doesn't make any difference what we are. You can say I'm anti-Catholic because we point up the Catholic Church. You can say I'm anti-this. It doesn't make any difference. You've got to deal with the truth. Okay. New and positive relationships for the future have to be based upon the truth. And you can't use anti as an excuse not to face the truth. That's it.
Professor, thank you for joining us on this broadcast. We'll now hear from Miles Davis, died this past weekend at 65, and we'll talk about him more at the end of this broadcast. Back in a moment with reporters talking about Professor Jeffries and also about Governor Cuomo's vision for a new New York. We're back. We're going to talk more about Professor Jeffries and what he's had to say. Also, we'll talk about Governor Cuomo and his new plan for New York, a $7 billion plan, and we'll talk about what that means for the city and for the state and for the taxpayers of New York City. Joining me now is Utrice Leid, managing editor of the City Sun, Jerry Nachman, who is the editor of the New York Post, which was mentioned in our recent conversation, and Sam Roberts, urban affairs columnist for the New York Times. Mr. Nachman, welcome to all of you. Good to have you here. First, Professor Jeffries, and where you see him in this community and the impact he's having, and whether those of us, the Post or this broadcast and the New York Times and Time Magazine, by engaging him, are doing some what?
Well, I think he's a living example to test us all in our devotion to the First Amendment. I believe that the First Amendment was specifically invented to protect unpopular speech, without which you wouldn't need a First Amendment. So I think the best thing to do with Leonard Jeffries is let him go. Res ipsa loquitur, as the lawyers say, the thing speaks for itself.
Yeah.
So I don't want him fired. I'm not sure he should be a department chairman. He's had a remarkable academic career, and I say that with some cynicism because his first job with a brand new doctorate was as a tenured full professor, which just doesn't happen in the American Academy.
Because they were creating a new, Black Studies program there at the university at the time.
But I think the best thing to do with Leonard Jeffries is just show it, let people draw their own inferences. The speech, people have accused the media of taking the speech out of context. Here's the context, as you alluded to. Every time an issue came up, he had to go to the Jewish question. Jews in Hollywood, Jews in the slave trade. Diane Ravitch, he referred to as a Texas Jew. He referred to somebody at City College as the head Jew at City College. We hear that 4 or 5 or 6 times, even in a 2-hour speech. And what's that about? Is that about history? Ironically, if I can just finish the point, that's multiculturalism. That's the curriculum of inclusion. And I have no quarrel with him on his curriculum issues. But I think it's tragic that he's now linking people's reaction to that speech to people's opposition to multiculturalism, because I believe they're very separate issues.
Who's listening to him, Utrice? And what kind of impact does he have within the black community?
Well, I'm very troubled by what Jerry has said. And I think the issue is not constitutional rights to free speech. I think the issue being raised here is whether what he's saying merits academic inquiry and whether it has some authenticity to it that we need to explore. I'm very uncomfortable with the idea that academic pursuits are being glossed over by the right of free speech.
You know, Utrice, real academics don't hold up books and wave them. They write books.
I don't know what real academics do, because I don't think you're one, and I don't think I'm one.
No, but
I think in the world...
we both went to college, and we both wrote papers, and we read books.
Yes, but our scholarship and our level of scholarship couldn't possibly compare to people who've devoted decades to the pursuit of inquiry into a legitimate area of inquiry. And I think that it is more convenient, perhaps it's sexier to sell papers, to deal with the so-called anti-Semitic content of his speeches and so forth, rather than deal with the salient issue of, is what Dr. Jeffries discussing worthy of serious academic
wouldn't
inquiry?
that more likely to be considered seriously if those questions of anti-Semitism weren't there and didn't plague him?
But by whom? And what do we mean by anti-Semitism?
People who feel maligned by them, that's who.
Well, the fact is, and I don't want to sound crude about it, the people who are offended really don't matter. What matters is whether, in the circle of academic inquiry, his ideas have merit. And we have seen...
His ideas with respect to curriculum changes?
No, because they're two separate and different, discrete things, unhinged from each other. The idea here is he has raised a question about the involvement of Jews in slavery. We have understood the involvement of Africans in slavery, the involvement of blacks in slavery, and involvement of other ethnic groups in slavery. What he's saying is that there seems to be a particular sore point about exploring the involvement of Jews in slavery.
Let me just interrupt it, because the point there has to be, and if you listen to people who've written about that time as well, it has to do with singling out and looking at a role that he seems to suggest is much, rather than just being peripheral, as other historians have suggested, seems to indicate that it was pervasive.
But in any case, all
the analysis... And that's a historical inaccuracy, and that's what alarms people.
Really.
It is.
No, in any case, we're discussing the issue as lay people, and we need to have this topic explored at an academic level, and it has not occurred.
Which topic?
The issue of the involvement of anyone in slavery, or slavery.
Sam Roberts.
The implication there is, I think, at least to some extent, maybe Utrice doesn't mean it, is that it hasn't been thoroughly explored at an academic level, including by Dr. Jeffries, despite the fact that he is articulating these theories. I think that, well, I think that, as Jerry says, it ought to speak for itself, and in fact, his entire speech probably ought to be required viewing for people so that people can draw their own conclusions, not out of context if he is accusing people of that, but looking at the whole speech. And I would also like to see some historical, of course no one would ever agree on which historians could annotate the speech, some historical research or confirmation or refutation of some of the points. But there's another underlying problem that Utrice raises, and it's a much broader one, and I think it's a fundamental one, and that is that we are too often, and the Jeffries case is perhaps an extreme one, not perhaps, it is an extreme one, we are too often willing to dismiss some of the messengers, whether it's Jeffries or occasionally Al Sharpton in a different category, without looking A, at the fact that their underlying message, and B, the fact that that message, regardless of whether many people agree with it or not, or think it's fundamentally wrong or not, has a clear resonance among people in a number of parts of the city.
I agree.
Yeah, that's a very important point.
Well,
that's the question that I was asking.
with
Who's
Sam.
listening and why is it resonating?
I agree with Sam in this case. Leonard Jeffries, I don't find him frightening. I find him fairly silly. I find Utrice's suggestion that there's something seriously academic about his inquiry preposterous. What scares me about Leonard Jeffries is I think a lot of people buy it.
Right.
I think Utrice may, or she may be saying so, but I think a lot of people buy it.
Why do you think they do?
I think there's a certain love of myth right now in our society, that people need their myths. I think it's interesting, and you touched on it, that what Leonard Jeffries does is he tries to condemn a group because some of its members...
Oh, that is clearly not so.
Utrice,
I mean, that is
when you-
absolutely not at all
when
the
you're
case.
talking
and I'm
in-
not a card-carrying member of the Leonard Jeffries fan
understand,
club.
but it's the
I'm
end-
saying what is fact.
When-
What
when
is
you're
fact
talk-
is
when you're
that he has raised an issue, and in the black academic world, it is not unusual for people discussing points of view that are deemed to be too impolitic to get marginalized like this.
Well,
and what the
it's not
white press has
marginalized.
done has
It's
marginalized.
It's not marginalized, and it's not race-based.
Does the name
If-
Sheikh Anta Diop mean anything
No,
to you?
could-
For example,
Could
does
we
the
just-
name mean
could we
anything
just-
to you?
Could we just stop
But it's
this
the same
CBS
thing.
stuff for a minute?
Jeffries is
If I
exactly
were
a
to say to
latter-day
you-
Sheikh Anta
If I were to
Diop
say to you,
and subjected to
Utrice,
the same treatment.
because 91% of the people in Rikers Island are of color, I have some reason to fear you individually and that you may commit a crime against me.
But that in fact is the position of the state.
Well, but I would be denounced for that. It would be preposterous for me to extrapolate from one statistic some predictor of your behavior.
But here we
And
are,
for
like a
Leonard-
bunch of mechanics
but for Leonard
discussing
Jeffries to keep-
astrophysics.
But for Leonard
It just does
Jeffries
not
to
work.
keep going back to the Jews.
But what do
the
you know?
Jews,
What do you know, or Sam, or I, or for that matter, Charlie, I don't mean to malign you, but what do we really know about this area of inquiry that he has raised?
Tell
what
me-
what
tell
kind
me
of
what-
scholarship
tell
and
me
what
what's
kind of
gained.
intellect do we bring?
Tell
Let
me
me
what's,
say what you
tell
can
me
do.
what's
Let-
gained.
well-
If Leonard Jeffries is correct, and Jews in the 15th century, before the pogroms, before the Holocaust, before most of them were driven out of Eastern Europe, after they were driven out of Spain, if Leonard Jeffries is correct, and some rich Jews played a role in the 16th century slave trade, tell me what the benefit is to
benefit
those
is-
of us dealing with multicultural curriculum in the latter decade, last
Who are
decade
those, by
of the
the way?
20th century.
Maybe the latter days of that tells you something right there. That
Tell
in
me.
the latter days of the 20th century, we're still discussing multiculturalism as a first event. The idea is that
Tell
we
me
need
why the Jewish
the
issue
benefit.
is credible.
I'll tell you what the benefit is. The benefit is that we need to understand that. It happens to be a jagged truth. It may jar some. It jarred blacks, many Africans, to know that many Africans were involved in the slave trade. But it happens to be something that needs to be understood.
Sam.
I'm troubled by the debate because I don't think we're getting to that heart of the issue. The fact that, and Jerry raises that there is, the fact that there is a willingness, maybe all too great a willingness for people to believe in myths. And
And the myth in this case is?
well, what may be a myth or what may not be a myth, but obviously Leonard Jeffries' detractors believe it is, and he insists that it is not, and that is the extent to which Jews or any other group were involved in this slave trade, and the extent to which a whole group should be
I don't
branded
think that's
with
where the
feel
argument is.
comfortable-
I don't
would
think
feel
that's...
comfortable if this idea of myth were substantiated by people qualified to determine what myth is.
Yes,
Please tell me what the head Jew at City College refers to you.
But listen to this. You take snippets of things, which is the way the New York Post, quote, broke the story. Fred Dicker finding it on a cable channel late at night. But let's talk about what happened. You can't take, he delivered a 2-hour talk to a group of people with particular informational needs, and he suited his style of delivery to that group of people.
What were their
What does that
informational
mean?
needs?
Their informational needs primarily were to learn about themselves
And
and to
what was-
learn about the truth of
What
history.
was stylistically apropos in
Well, if I'm
referring to
talking
Diane
to a group-
Ravitch as a Texas Jew and referring to a colleague at a university as the head Jew in
All right,
that
if you
university?
say somebody is a Texas Jew, what does that mean? Is that some way a malicious thing to say?
In his case, I think it clearly was.
Oh,
I
so
think
it
that was
depends
the
on who
inference.
says what? And
Sure.
Oh, I see. I
Let
didn't
me-
know that. I didn't know.
Well, sure. I mean, James Watt's career ended that way. Earl
No, because he
Butz's
was
career
stupid.
ended
James Watts
that
was just
way.
stupid.
Al Campanus's career
He was
ended
another
that
stupid
way.
person.
Jimmy Greek's career ended that way.
Well, Jimmy
so I
would
guess
never
Leonard
win a
Jeffries
prize
is
for
stupid too.
intellect at all.
Let me raise this one last question. How is the voice of Leonard Jeffries viewed within the black community?
I
of
think
this
we
area?
ought to go into the black community and find out.
And what do you
I'm
think
not a
we'd find?
spokesperson
No,
for
but you
it.
know.
What I find is that people want to know about their history. The City Sun, which happens
But
to
that's
be
obvious,
an
isn't it?
extraordinary black paper,
Yeah.
features history every week.
Right.
The third page of our paper features history. It is because it is a unique
But there's
informational
no,
need
but
among
there's no
black
debate
people.
about that, is there?
No what is?
Debate about the need to understand your history.
No, well, the need to know it,
Yeah.
not understand it, but
And
to
to
know
know
it. Because in the United States of America and in other places that have been colonized, the denial of information about one's culture and one's history is key to oppression.
Is there a need to question a version of history such as Jeffries?
There's a need to question all versions of history, including Jeffries. I don't think for 1 minute he suggests that he is the factotum of history. I think he knows that, and this is what, in fact, I understand him to be asking for, academic inquiry into what it is he said. The reason I asked you about Cheikh Anta Diop, for example, is that he was pilloried.
Yeah.
He happened to have written seminal works on African civilization, which has, to this day, are being denied by white scholars.
Well, I heard in the green room a moment ago that the pharaohs were probably black as well. I heard that from one of Professor Leonard Jeffries' colleagues. So I infer from that when I hear the Negro spiritual, let my people go, when Israel was in Egypt land, we were talking about black Egyptians as holding the Jews.
There is no
in
logic
Egypt.
to the quantum leaps you make, Jerry.
Well,
I don't
it's-
know.
All right, let me
Seems logical
refer
to
to, let me look at another newspaper that's not represented here. This is the Village Voice. It says the new anti-Semitism, Jew baiting makes a comeback. Do you see a real alarm here, Sam?
I certainly see an alarm among Jews, yes. And I think there's a real concern that they are being singled out. It's fascinating. There was a forum last week sponsored by another paper not represented here today, the Daily News, about race relations. And there was a feeling on the part of the mayor and among others that they were seeking solace in the fact that this was not simply a conflict between blacks and Jews. It was like the old Tom Lehrer song, everyone hates everybody else and there's enough hate to go around. But I think if you look at what happened in Crown Heights, and if you look at what Leonard Jeffries has said in many cases, and not just scholarship, but remarks that I think many people could regard as gratuitous, like his description of Diane Ravitch, then there may well be reason for people to be fearful and concerned.
And what's necessary to
Oh, I dismiss that.
dismiss
I
it?
dismiss that altogether.
Why?
Because it simply doesn't have very much merit.
That there is on the
I
part
don't
of members of
Should
this
be
understand.
community.
concerned?
No,
or-
I don't understand that the affirmation of one's history necessarily becomes threatening to people of another group.
If another group is singled out,
What do you mean by singling out?
I don't
do
hear-
we now engage in denial of fact, or what do
let
you
me,
do?
let me
At
end this
Gavin
by
Cato's
asking
Do we
you-
now
go ahead.
deny the Germans
At
conducted
Gavin-
a pogrom because it singles out the
No.
Germans?
At Gavin Cato's funeral?
Reverend Sharpton referred to the Hasidim as diamond merchants.
So that's Sharpton.
Well, I
So
understand.
are you implying that Sharpton speaks universally for all
But
black people?
I think he has a large following. I think it was also interesting that no one denounced
But
it. I
what do
think it
you
was
mean?
interesting that a lot of the media didn't cover it. And since one of the questions here is there black anti-Semitism, and we have some evidence of it, that there was an attempt in Crown Heights to link as co-equal the tragic accidental death of Gavin Cato and the lynching
Yeah.
of Yankel Rosenbaum.
But there
as if-
is a very important link that we need to understand, because there is a contextual history to both those things that put them together.
No, nothing put them together.
Because
Except a mob,
it does not suit
no,
you.
because a mob ran through the streets and said,
No, it's
kill
not.
the Jew.
No, it is not
That
that
really
simple.
happened.
It is the simplistic problems that we've been having all the time.
You're right, it was
simplistic analysis.
It was very simple.
Crown
a group
Heights
of black
has been a
youths ran
community-
through the streets
Crown
and
Heights has
said,
been a
kill the
commu-
Jew,
No, Crown
and
Heights-
stabbed the Hasidic kid to death.
What you're seeing is the end result of a choreographed program to deny certain people their democratic rights in Crown Heights. It is ugly, but it is real.
So for which murder is an appropriate antidote?
No
Yeah.
murder is ever an appropriate antidote, but it is the natural
I have
outcome.
to interrupt this at this time. Thank you very much. We did not talk about Governor Cuomo's plan for New York. Can I get you to come back and do that?
Sure.
Very soon.
Then we'll go to the metaphysical.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Jerry. Pleasure to have you here. More of Miles Davis, and when we come back, we'll also talk with David Grubin, who is the filmmaker who made an extraordinary 4-hour presentation on public television of Lyndon Baines Johnson, the 36th President of the United States. Back in a moment. I saw that was the incredible sound of Miles Davis, died at age 65 in California. On Saturday, we'll have more from Miles Davis, the sound of Miles Davis, later in this broadcast. Let me introduce you now to David Grubin, a man that I met many years ago when we both were working with Bill Moyers on public television. And I've kept up with your career, and now this extraordinary 4 hours of television. 2 hours have just passed, a glimpse at Lyndon Johnson. Here is what the New York Times said, to flatter you a little bit. It is a powerful story, powerfully rendered. However one fully assesses Johnson's accomplishments against his disasters, he seems more appealing here than he did a quarter century ago. Did you find him more appealing than you thought you might?
Well, he was always stiff and colorless to me as a 19-year-old looking at Lyndon Johnson becoming president. This was a chance to really get to know him, and I did find him an exciting person to get to know.
What was it about him that, I mean, as he revealed himself through all these interviews and through the testimony of people who knew him and through the historians as well as the people who served him, what emerges from this? What was it that drove him? What kind of picture do we get of Lyndon Johnson?
Well, you know, I think he was a very lonely man at heart, and liked to be surrounded by people, and wanted to be loved. I think at bottom, here was someone who wanted people to like him and wanted to do good things so people would like him.
Yeah. What about him that you found unappealing? Was it the drive, the ego, the singular pursuit of power?
Well, I think it's that he could be very cruel to people. He could really hurt someone close to him. The next moment he could turn around and show terrible remorse and feel badly about it.
And then give them gifts.
Exactly. You know, one moment it's a terrible tongue lashing. He'd feel so guilty, get a guy a car.
Yeah.
He was like that.
Sounds like Elvis. Let me take a look. This is, as I said, 2 hours have already appeared on public television, 2 hours more on Tuesday night. Here's an excerpt from a highly regarded documentary, a picture, a portrait, LBJ.
On January 5th, 1967, Lady Bird Johnson wrote in her diary, "A miasma of trouble hangs over everything. American planes had already struck most of the important targets in North Vietnam by the end of 1967. Several times, Johnson ordered a halt in the bombing and waited for a response from Ho. None came. Johnson's generals thought he was too cautious, staying their hand, preventing them from using America's enormous firepower to force a victory. But Johnson was tormented by a persistent nightmare, the fear of triggering World War III. In the dark at night, he said, I would lay awake picturing my boys flying around North Vietnam, asking myself, what if one of those targets you pick today triggers off Russia or China? Johnson spent many hours personally selecting where the bombs should fall.
The war was his tragedy, as we all know.
It really was. It destroyed his dreams. That's what I didn't understand about him, was that he didn't want that war. He really had a whole domestic agenda. He had the Great Society, the war on poverty, and all that was shattered by the war.
And he understood it, and he grappled with it, and he agonized. And why was he so, pick the targets, the portrait we get of him.
Yeah.
The agony for him, as Lady Bird talks about. What did it do to him personally?
I think he was obsessed by it. You know, presidents don't choose the bombing sites. There he was, choosing the sites, waking up in the middle of the night to get the casualty reports. I think it tore him up inside, and he grew more and more rigid, and I think it made it impossible for him to make realistic decisions finally.
Did he understand what it was doing to his presidency?
Well, I think he could see that it was destroying his presidency, but at the same time, I don't think he wanted to see it, and he was trying to hold on.
Was it easy or hard to make? Did you find people ready to talk about him? Ronnie Duggar, who's a very interesting Texan and a critic of Johnson, says at one point he was just as interesting as hell.
Well, what I found interesting about somebody like Duggar or any of these people is people love to tell a Johnson story. He made such a big impression on them that they had a very good time talking about him. But he also, in talking about him, all kinds of memories had come back, and people could hate Johnson and they could love him, and it'd be all in one person. Duggar hated him and loved him. Roger Wilkins hated him and loved him at the same time.
Roger Wilkins being a black man who, what role did he play?
Yeah, he was in the administration. He was an assistant attorney general.
And he hated him and loved him.
At the same time.
Loved him because of his commitment that he came as a Southerner to support civil rights.
That's right.
And hated him because he let it all slip away?
I think that's right, and because of Vietnam, and because it was hard for Johnson to understand what was happening to the civil rights
Anybody
movement.
that you wanted to talk to that wouldn't talk now for whatever reason because the memory is too...
McNamara wouldn't talk.
Still won't talk about the war.
Still won't talk about it. I think the wounds are too deep.
Yeah. Anyone else?
George Bundy wouldn't talk to us, and those two have a lot to say.
Well, they were certainly at the beginning. Mrs. Johnson today, you interviewed her. She talks about him. What have the biographies? Here's the newest one, Lone Star Rising, Lyndon Johnson at his times, 1908 to 1960, Robert Dallek, which is a little bit more favorable than the Robert Caro biographies so far, it should be said. What are those biographies doing to the legend of Lyndon Johnson? How are they changing the sense of him?
I think there continues to be a struggle over that history. And I think it's because the problems that Johnson's faced, they haven't gone away. And we're still dealing with them. So what sort of domestic policy should we have? What about the poor, the Americans who have been left behind? You don't hear our leaders talking about that much anymore. Johnson did. And the question now is, how do we deal with all that?
I've talked to reporters who covered him during the time, and they tell me these incredible stories about the Johnson treatment, that he had an infinite capacity. The film tonight talked about it in one interesting way with Sarge Shriver when he was being asked to be on the head of the war on poverty. Johnson calls him up and says, I want you to do this, and Sarge says, well, I need to talk about it. So then he calls him up again and says, I'll call you back in an hour because I got to make a speech, and he pick up the story.
Well, he says, I've got the whole cabinet here. And,
he's whispering as if it's...
Yeah, as if the cabinet really is there. And Sarge, you've got to do it for your president, you know. And,
this is your president.
Yeah. And what you get is this, he was a great actor, Johnson, and he was acting on a great stage.
What comes out with respect to the relationship with Robert Kennedy and how he felt about the Kennedys?
Well, I think that John F. Kennedy always treated Johnson well, but Johnson was uncomfortable in the Kennedy circle, and I don't think
because he felt inferior?
He was educated at San Marcos, Texas, Southwest State Texas Teachers College, and he always felt inferior because of that. Here were all these people who had gone to Harvard. He called them Harvards, and he didn't feel he fit in with them.
How long did it take you to make this?
It was over 4 years.
Yeah, just this, doing nothing else?
It was
for the most
fairly,
part.
yeah.
And what does that do? I want to ask Robert Caro. He's spending most of his adult life dealing with Lyndon Johnson. What does it do to you as a filmmaker? I mean, how does it change you? How does it impact on you?
Well, you know, I think it really allowed me to come to terms with the 60s. I grew up in the 60s, and I had a chance to look at those turbulent times with some distance and try to understand them. And to come to get some kind of feeling for this man, Lyndon Johnson, who was at the center of it all, looming so large over all our lives.
His best quality was?
I think he didn't forget the poor. He didn't forget those the oppressed. I think that's
because of his roots in
I
Texas.
think
He
so.
came away with a sense that he wanted to change the plight of people.
I think he sincerely did.
Yeah, and that in the end is his tragedy because it was derailed by the
Yes.
war. David Grubin, thank you very much. Pleasure. 2 hours Tuesday night concludes LBJ. I thank David and also want to make one note. We welcome your thoughts and opinions on this broadcast. The New York Times obit on Sunday got it right. It said simply, Miles Davis, genius of jazz, dies at 65. Miles was born in Alton, Illinois and grew up in St. Louis, but New York was where he came of age as a trumpet player. He came here in 1944 to attend Juilliard, but soon left and replaced Dizzy Gillespie with a Charlie Parker combo. He was part of the bebop era and played with many of the legends of jazz, including Parker and Gillespie, Coleman Hawkins, Sonny Rollins, John Coltrane, and many others. Max Roach, the great drummer, called him one of the restless ones because he was always looking to something new. I spent a day with him several years ago and asked how he would like to be remembered. He said in that distinctive voice, "The sound, the sound." He is dead, but the music lives.